While Anne Boleyn paced her cell in the Tower of London, counting down her final hours, her husband was already in bed with her replacement. Just 1 mile away, King Henry VIII rode through darkness to secret meetings with Jane Seymour, the woman who would be queen before Anne's body turned cold. This isn't romance. This is calculated murder dressed as love. If you're ready for the darkest royal betrayal in history, stay with me. And if you want more hidden truths the history books won't tell you, hit that subscribe button now. Let's begin in September 1535. The royal procession arrived at Wolf Hall on a crisp autumn morning in 1535. King Henry VIII had come to the Seymour estate in Wiltshire during his annual progress through the countryside, bringing with him his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. The irony would become unbearable in the months to come. Among the servants and ladies greeting the royal party stood Jane Seymour, pale, modest, unremarkable at first glance. She had served in Anne's household for years, a quiet shadow always present but never demanding attention. 27 years old, plain-faced by Tudor standards, with a reputation for needlework and silence. But something shifted during that visit. Henry watched her move through the halls of her family home. The way she kept her eyes lowered. The way she spoke only when spoken to. Everything Anne was not. Where Anne sparkled with wit and confidence, Jane offered submission. Where Anne challenged and debated, Jane agreed and obeyed. The contrast intoxicated him. What Jane understood, what her ambitious brothers Edward and Thomas understood, was that Henry had grown tired of being managed. Anne had won him through boldness, through refusal, through making herself a prize he had to destroy his first marriage to claim. But now, married to her, he found that same fire exhausting. She had opinions about religion, about politics, about his affairs. She erupted in jealous rages. She had given him a daughter when he demanded a son. Jane offered something different, something that looked like peace. By the time the royal party left Wolf Hall, seeds had been planted. Not love, not yet, but possibility. Henry had noticed her. And in the vicious ecosystem of the Tudor court, being noticed by the king was both blessing and death sentence, depending on how carefully you played the game. Jane returned to court with the queen, resuming her duties as lady-in-waiting. She dressed Anne. She attended her in the bedchamber. She smiled and curtsied, and kept her secrets locked behind that pale, placid face. Anne suspected nothing. Why would she? Jane was furniture, harmless, loyal. But the king's eyes followed Jane, now during court gatherings, brief glances. Nothing scandalous yet. Nothing Anne could point to, can name as betrayal. Just a shift in attention, subtle as a shadow moving across a sundial. In the corridors of power, others noticed too. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthlessly efficient chief minister, saw opportunity. The Seymour brothers saw their family's fortune rising. The conservatives, who hated Anne's religious reforms, saw a potential weapon. And Jane, quiet Jane, understood her role perfectly. She would be everything Anne was not. Submissive where Anne commanded, pale where Anne shone, English where Anne carried French sophistication, a vessel for the king's fantasies of domestic tranquility, and most importantly, sons. The game had begun. Anne just didn't know she was already losing. Back at court, the memory of Wolf Hall stayed with Henry in a way he did not admit aloud. Officially, he was still the devoted husband of Anne Boleyn. Unofficially, his attention had found a new orbit. Jane Seymour, the quiet lady who had blended into the background for years, now occupied his thoughts at odd, inconvenient moments. The first move did not happen in a crowded hall or a public procession. It happened in the controlled privacy of a royal message. One day, Jane was summoned to her chamber and handed a small bundle from the king. Inside was a purse of gold coins, and folded with ceremony, a letter in Henry's own hand. The meaning was unmistakable. This was not a simple reward for service. It was an invitation, a signal that the king wished to draw her into the same dangerous dance that had once elevated Anne. This was the point where most women of the court would have simply obeyed the current of power. Accept the gift, accept the letter, accept the unspoken role. King's mistress, king's favorite. A path lined with silks and jewels that usually ended in ruin. Jane did not follow that script. She did something so unexpected, it rewired the entire game. Instead of breaking the seal, she kept the letter closed. Instead of fastening the purse at her belt, she refused to touch the money. In full view of the messenger, she lifted the letter to her lips, kissed it with outward respect, and then returned it unopened. The gold went back as well, as if it were poisoned. Her answer, carried back to Henry, was simple and devastating. She could not accept such gifts, because she had no greater treasure than her honor. If the king wished to favor her, it must be as a wife, not as a plaything. For a man used to being obeyed in every private desire, that answer struck like a challenge. Henry was not dealing with another dazzled court girl. Someone had prepared Jane carefully. She had been taught exactly what to refuse, and exactly how to refuse it in a way that made her look virtuous, not ungrateful. She did not insult him. She did not lecture him. She simply put her purity between herself and his desire, like a shield. And it worked. Instead of anger, the refusal deepened his obsession. Here was a woman who seemed to belong to an older world, the world of Catherine of Aragon. Pious, obedient, untouched by scandal. A woman who would not share his bed unless he put a crown on her head first. To him, that looked like proof of goodness. Word of Jane's bold modesty spread quickly through the inner circles. Her brothers understood at once how powerful this moment was. So did those at court who longed for Anne's downfall. If Jane became the symbol of true obedience and chastity, then Anne could more easily be painted as the opposite. Corrupt, dangerous, unfit to be queen. From that point forward, Henry did not look at Jane as a passing distraction. He began to imagine her as a solution, a way out of a marriage that no longer satisfied him, a path toward the one thing he craved more than passion, a legitimate son. Anne still held the title of queen, but with a single unopened letter and a returned purse of gold, Jane had taken control of the story. By February 1536, what had begun as private fascination became public maneuvering. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapais, a man whose job was to notice everything, began recording Henry's interest in Jane Seymour in his dispatches back to Spain. The king was no longer hiding his shift in affection. Court insiders whispered. Bets were placed. Everyone could feel the temperature changing. But Jane was not navigating this alone. Her brother Edward Seymour had been watching, calculating, positioning. This was the opportunity their family had waited generations for. The Seymours were minor gentry, respectable but unremarkable. Now they stood on the edge of royalty itself, if they played correctly. Edward understood that his sister's value increased with every moment she remained untouched, unavailable, virtuous. Thomas Cromwell understood it too. The king's chief minister was a man who built his power on reading the future before it arrived. He had helped Henry break from Rome to marry Anne. Now, Anne had become a liability. She had not produced a son. She had made enemies. She was in Cromwell's way politically. If the king wanted a new wife, Cromwell would make sure that path was smooth, calculable, and advantageous to his own position. So Cromwell made a move that revealed how far the plan had already advanced. He gave up his own apartments at court, handing them over to Edward Seymour. On the surface, a generous gesture to a rising courtier. In reality, it was staging. It meant Jane could now be hosted in rooms connected to the king's private chambers, with her brother present as chaperone. Proximity without scandal. Access without accusation. The rules were set clearly. Henry agreed he would only visit Jane when her brother or other family members were present. No closed doors, no whispers of impropriety. Everything designed to make Jane look like the opposite of a mistress. She would not be another Mary Bullen, used and discarded. She would not be another Anne, who had waited years in limbo as the great matter dragged on. Jane would be queen, or she would be nothing. This was a performance, carefully directed. Henry played the role of honorable suitor. Jane played the role of modest maiden. Her family played the role of protective guardians. And beneath it all, the real work was being done. Legal minds exploring how to end the marriage to Anne, not through divorce, not through annulment. Those paths had already been exhausted. Through something darker, Cromwell began gathering information, watching Anne's behavior, noting who she spoke to, who she laughed with, how she moved through the court. He was building a case, though Anne did not yet know she was the accused. Meanwhile, Henry spent more and more time in those borrowed apartments, sitting across from Jane in the presence of her ever-watchful brother. They spoke of simple things, of family, of faith, of the kind of peaceful, orderly marriage he claimed to want. Jane listened, agreed, smiled her small, controlled smile. She never overstepped, never pushed. She had learned the lesson and forgot. The king liked to feel he was in control, even when he was being led. Anne Boleyn was not a fool. She had clawed her way to the throne through intelligence, strategy, and an iron will. She knew how courts worked. She knew how kings wandered. But knowing and witnessing are two different kinds of pain. In late January, Henry had been thrown from his horse during a jousting tournament. The fall was brutal. He lay unconscious for hours. The court held its breath, terrified the king might die. When he finally woke, bruised and furious, he retreated to recover. Anne, pregnant at the time, was so shaken by the news that she miscarried days later. It was a boy, her last real chance to secure her position. Henry showed no sympathy, only cold disappointment. While he recovered from his injuries, Anne learned where he was spending his time, not with her, not in prayer or solitude, with Jane Seymour, in those convenient apartments now occupied by her brother. The visits were always chaperoned, always technically proper, but Anne understood what propriety could hide. Then came the moment that shattered any pretense. Anne walked into a room and found Jane sitting on Henry's lap. The king's hands rested comfortably on her waist. Jane's face was calm, composed, as if she belonged there, as if Anne were the intruder. The rage that erupted was not the rage of a jealous woman. It was the rage of someone who recognized her own story being rewritten with someone else in the lead role. Anne had once been the other woman. She had sat in rooms with Henry while Catherine of Aragon still wore the crown. She had accepted gifts, whispered promises, played the game of patience. Now she was Catherine, and Jane was her. Anne's fury made things worse. Every outburst, every accusation, every scene only confirmed what Henry's inner circle was already whispering. That she was difficult, unstable, impossible to manage. Jane, by contrast, never raised her voice, never demanded, never complained. The comparison was intentional, and it was damning. By April, the visits between Henry and Jane had become routine. They were no longer hiding the courtship. Conversations about a future marriage were happening openly among those close to the king. Jane's family was already being elevated. Her brother Edward received new titles, new lands, new access. Anne could feel the ground disappearing beneath her feet. She tried to fight back the only way she knew how, with wit, with charm, with the sharpness that had once captivated Henry. But he no longer wanted sharp. He wanted soft. He no longer wanted a partner who challenged him. He wanted someone who obeyed. On the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested during a tournament and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were monstrous: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king, treason of the highest order. None of it was true, but truth no longer mattered. Henry had already decided what came next, and Jane Seymour, patient and pale, was waiting. Anne had been locked in the Tower of London for 12 days when Jane Seymour was moved to Chelsea, not arrested, not hidden, moved with ceremony and purpose to a residence carefully chosen for its location. Sir Nicholas Carew handled the arrangements personally. He was one of the king's closest companions, a man who had turned against Anne and now backed Jane's rise. The house he selected sat along the Thames, quiet and comfortable, with gardens that sloped down to the water. It looked like a peaceful retreat. It was actually a staging ground, because Chelsea was exactly 1 mile from the king's own apartments, 1 mile by barge on the river. A short, silent journey in the dark, close enough that Henry could visit without drawing crowds or questions, far enough to maintain the illusion that he was a grieving husband, distracted by matters of state, not a man already planning his next wedding. Jane settled into the house with her usual composure. Her family surrounded her, her brothers, her attendants, everyone invested in making sure she did nothing to jeopardize what was now within reach. The instructions were clear: remain modest, remain patient, let the king come to you. And he did, while Anne sat in the same rooms in the Tower where she had once prepared for her coronation. Henry rode quietly across the water to see Jane. The visits happened in early morning or late evening, times when the river traffic was light and the court was elsewhere. He did not announce these trips. He did not bring crowds of attendants. Just a small barge, a few oarsmen sworn to silence, and the short pull of the current toward Chelsea. What did they talk about in those meetings? There are no records, no letters, no confessions. But the purpose was obvious. This was not romance. It was transaction. Jane was being prepared for queenship. Henry was being soothed into certainty. Every visit reinforced the narrative he had built in his mind: that Anne had been a mistake, a seduction, a woman who had tricked him into a doomed marriage, and that Jane represented correction, a return to order. Jane played her part flawlessly. She did not ask about Anne. She did not express doubt or hesitation. She accepted the situation as if it were the natural unfolding of God's will. Her faith was simple, untroubled, exactly what Henry wanted to see. While this quiet courtship continued, the legal machinery turned. Archbishop Cranmer had already been working behind the scenes, preparing documents that would annul Henry's marriage to Anne on a technicality. The grounds were flimsy, invented, but they would serve. Once Anne was declared never truly married, Henry would be free. Not divorced, not a widower yet, just free, as if the last 3 years had been erased. But annulment was not enough, because Anne alive, even stripped of her title, was still dangerous. She could speak, she could appeal, she could remind people that she had once been chosen, loved, crowned. So the charges stood: treason, adultery, conspiracy, and the sentence was already written. Jane waited in Chelsea, 1 mile away from the king, 11 miles away from the Tower, close enough to everything, removed from the blood. The trial began in the great hall of the Tower. 2,000 spectators crowded in to watch. This was theater, not justice. The outcome had been decided before the first witness spoke. Anne stood accused alongside 5 men: Mark Smeaton, a musician; Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool; William Brereton, a groom of the Privy Chamber; Francis Weston, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; and her own brother, George Bullen, Viscount Rochford. The charges were grotesque, designed to destroy not just her life, but her reputation forever. Adultery with all 5, plotting the king's death, incest with her brother, The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. Mark Smeaton had confessed under torture, but his confession was vague and contradictory. The other men denied everything. Witnesses placed Anne in different locations than the alleged encounters. Dates did not match. Timelines collapsed under scrutiny. None of it mattered. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presided over the trial. He showed no mercy, no hesitation. Family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against survival. The Howard family had risen with Anne. Now they would distance themselves from her fall, sacrificing her to save their own position. Anne defended herself with the same sharp intelligence that had once captivated Henry. She dismantled the accusations point by point. She exposed inconsistencies. She spoke clearly, without tears or hysteria, refusing to give them the spectacle of a broken woman. Observers noted her composure, even her wit. Some who watched felt uneasy, sensing the trial was less about truth than about clearing a path. But the jury had been selected carefully. 26 peers, many of whom owed their positions to the king, many of whom had reasons to want Anne gone. When they returned their verdict, it was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death, burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Anne received the judgment without flinching. She had known this was coming. The only surprise would have been acquittal. Her brother was tried immediately after. The charge of incest was particularly obscene, added specifically to make reconciliation impossible, to ensure that even those who pitied Anne would recoil from the accusations. George Bullen faced his judges with the same dignity his sister had shown. He also was found guilty. He also was sentenced to death. By the end of the day, all 6 were condemned. The men would die first, executed on Tower Hill 2 days later. Anne would follow. But before the executions could proceed, one more piece of the plan fell into place. Archbishop Cranmer, the man who had validated Henry's marriage to Anne just 3 years earlier, now declared that marriage null and void. The grounds were absurd. A supposed contract of marriage, a technicality so weak it would never have stood in any honest court. It meant Anne's daughter Elizabeth was now illegitimate. It meant Anne had never truly been queen. It also meant Henry was free to remarry immediately, without the complications of widowhood. The trap was complete. Anne would die not as a queen, but as no one. Anne spent her final night awake. Sleep was impossible. The execution had been set for 8 o'clock the following morning, and she had been told to prepare herself. In the hours of darkness, she prayed. She spoke with the women assigned to watch her, making small requests, asking them to remember her kindly. She practiced the short speech she would give on the scaffold, choosing her words carefully. Any criticism of the king would endanger her daughter. Any protest might be seen as treason even in death. She had asked for one mercy, that her execution be carried out by a skilled swordsman rather than the traditional axe. Henry had granted it. A specialist had been summoned from Calais, an expert executioner who used a sword instead of the clumsy, brutal axe that sometimes required multiple blows. It was a strange kindness from a man orchestrating a murder, but Anne accepted it. A swift death was better than a butchered one. As dawn approached, she waited for the sound of footsteps, the knock on the door, the constable coming to lead her out. 8 o'clock came, then 9, then 10. No one arrived. The execution had been delayed. No explanation was given. Anne and her attendants sat in confusion, the tension stretching unbearably. Was it a reprieve? A last-minute intervention? Hope, dangerous and painful, flickered briefly. But the delay was not mercy. It was logistics. The swordsman had not arrived on time. Officials were scrambling. Messages were being sent. The machinery of death had jammed, and Anne was left waiting in a kind of limbo worse than certainty. While Anne endured this torture of waiting, other mechanisms moved forward without pause. Archbishop Cranmer had already signed the dispensation that would allow Henry to marry Jane. The document sat ready, dated, legal. It did not matter that Anne still breathed. The future had already been written. At Chelsea, Jane continued her routine. She did not pace. She did not ask frantic questions. She had been told what to expect and when to expect it. Her role was to remain calm, to project the image of a woman who had done nothing wrong, who was simply accepting God's will. If she felt any fear, any doubt, any flicker of guilt, she buried it beneath layers of performance and prayer. Henry, meanwhile, remained strangely buoyant. Witnesses reported that he seemed lighter, almost cheerful during this period. He spoke of the future. He made plans. He did not mention Anne except to repeat the charges against her, as if convincing himself over and over that what he had set in motion was justice, not murder. The hours dragged on through May 18th. Anne requested communion, seeking some comfort in ritual. The chaplain attended her. She reaffirmed her innocence before God, though she knew earthly judgment had already condemned her. When night fell again, she was told the execution would proceed the following morning. No more delays. The swordsman had arrived. Everything was ready. She did not sleep that night either. There was no time left for sleep, only for waiting. And across the river, 1 mile away, Jane Seymour waited too. The morning of May 19th arrived cold and gray. Anne was led from her rooms just after 8 o'clock, flanked by the constable of the Tower and her attendants. She wore a dark gray damask gown with a crimson petticoat beneath, a white ermine cape draped over her shoulders. Her hair was pinned up, her neck exposed. She walked steadily, without stumbling, her face composed. A small crowd had gathered on Tower Green, not the public execution ground, but a more private space within the Tower walls. Henry had granted her that much. She would not die as a spectacle for the masses. Only select witnesses, officials, and a few members of the court were present. Among them were men who had once bowed to her as queen. Anne climbed the scaffold steps carefully. She turned to face the crowd, and in a clear voice, she delivered the speech she had prepared. She did not proclaim her innocence directly. To do so would endanger Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke of accepting God's judgment, of praying for the king, of asking those present to remember her kindly. Her words were careful, restrained, designed to protect the daughter she would never see again. She removed her ermine cape and the hood that covered her hair. One of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, repeating softly, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." The swordsman had positioned himself carefully, his blade hidden in the straw so Anne would not see it and tense. He called out to his assistant, a deliberate distraction, and as Anne turned her head slightly toward the sound, he swung. One stroke. Clean, fast. It was over in a breath. Her body was wrapped quickly, placed in an old elm arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower, without ceremony, without a marked grave. The woman who had once been crowned Queen of England disappeared into the ground as if she had never mattered. Within hours, the news reached Henry. He did not mourn. He did not retreat into private grief. Instead, he changed into bright clothing, mounted his horse, and rode out toward Chelsea. The river was calm that morning. The barge that carried him cut smoothly through the water, oarsmen pulling in steady rhythm. 1 mile, just 1 mile between the tower where Anne's body lay cooling and the house where Jane Seymour waited. Henry arrived before noon. He entered the residence with the confidence of a man freed from a burden, not haunted by a death. Jane greeted him with her characteristic quietness, her pale hands folded, her expression serene. If she knew what had happened that morning, if she understood that Anne's blood was still fresh on the scaffold, she gave no sign. They spoke of the future, of marriage, of the family they would build. The past had been erased. The inconvenient queen was gone, and the next one was already chosen. Less than 24 hours separated the death of one queen from the formal betrothal of the next. In any other circumstance, such speed would have been seen as obscene. But Henry had carefully constructed a narrative where none of this was his fault. Anne had betrayed him. Anne had plotted against him. Anne had never been his true wife. In his mind, he was not replacing a murdered spouse. He was correcting a mistake. The betrothal took place on May 20th, the day after Anne's execution. Not weeks later, not even days. The very next morning. It happened quietly, without the grand public ceremony that had marked Henry's previous engagements. This was deliberate. Too much celebration would look callous, but too much delay would allow doubt to creep in, questions to spread, opposition to organize. So it happened quickly, privately, efficiently. Jane accepted the king's proposal with the same measured grace she had shown throughout the courtship. There were no tears of joy, no dramatic declarations. She simply said yes, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. Perhaps to her it had. She had been prepared for this moment for months, coached by her brothers, guided by Cromwell, shaped into the perfect image of what Henry wanted. The court received the news with a mixture of shock and strategic silence. Those who had supported Anne were already scrambling to distance themselves, rewriting their own histories to avoid suspicion. Those who had opposed her felt vindicated, but were careful not to gloat too openly. And those who understood politics simply adjusted their allegiances, owing to the new reality. Technically, Henry was not even a widower yet in the traditional sense. The annulment Cranmer had issued meant that, legally, his marriage to Anne had never existed. She had died as a convicted traitor, not as his wife. It was a legal fiction designed to smooth the transition, to make his remarriage seem less like indecent haste, and more like a man finally entering a legitimate union after years of mistake. Jane's family wasted no time capitalizing on their new status. Her brother Edward was elevated rapidly, granted lands and titles that reflected his sister's rise. The Seymours, who had been minor gentry just months before, were now intimately tied to the throne. Their fortune had turned on Jane's ability to remain patient, modest, and obedient while the queen was destroyed. Foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their rulers, noting the speed of events with barely concealed astonishment. Eustace Chapais, the imperial ambassador who had despised Anne, approved of Jane, but even he remarked on how quickly everything had moved. The French, who had supported Anne, were stunned into silence. But Henry did not care about appearances anymore. He had what he wanted, a compliant bride, a clear path forward, and the hope of a son. The fact that this path was built on fabricated charges, judicial murder, and ruthless political maneuvering did not trouble him. He had convinced himself this was justice. And Jane, standing beside him now as his betrothed, had convinced herself of something too, that she had done nothing wrong, that this was God's will, that she was innocent. History would remember otherwise. Even after the formal betrothal, the visits to Chelsea continued. Henry could have brought Jane to court immediately, installed her in royal apartments, begun the public preparations for their wedding. But he chose a different approach. He kept coming to her, quietly, by barge, in the early morning hours when mist still hung over the Thames. There was something about those private journeys that satisfied him. Perhaps it was the illusion of courtship, of pursuit, even though the outcome was already certain. Perhaps it was the secrecy itself, the feeling that he and Jane existed in a protected space away from the judgment and gossip of the court. Or perhaps it was simply that Jane, in that borrowed house with her family around her, felt safer to him than the complications waiting back at Whitehall. The meetings followed a careful pattern. Henry would arrive unannounced, though Jane always seemed prepared. Her brother Edward was always present, playing the role of chaperone, even though the engagement made such formality unnecessary. They would sit together in the main hall or in the gardens if the weather allowed, discussing the wedding, the future, the kind of household Jane would keep as queen. Jane listened more than she spoke. When she did offer opinions, they were mild, agreeable, never challenging. She deferred to Henry on matters of state, of religion, of policy. She expressed no interest in involving herself in politics, the way Anne had. She would be a different kind of queen, she assured him. A quieter one, a more traditional one. Henry found this deeply comforting. The years with Anne had been turbulent, exhausting. She had opinions about everything. The break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the men he kept in his council. She had fought with ambassadors, alienated allies, made enemies faster than he could manage. Jane promised none of that. She would tend to her household, bear his children, pray for his soul, and leave governance to him. It was exactly the script Henry wanted to hear, and Jane delivered it flawlessly, day after day, visit after visit. But beneath the surface, the planning was relentless. Seamstresses were already at work on Jane's wedding gown and coronation robes. Jewelers were resetting gems from Anne's confiscated collection into new pieces for Jane to wear. Household staff were being reassigned, rooms refurnished, symbols of the previous queen scrubbed away and replaced. Anne's badge, the falcon, was chiseled off walls and replaced with Jane's chosen emblem, a phoenix rising from a castle. The symbolism was grotesque. The phoenix represented rebirth, renewal, rising from ashes. But it was Anne who had been burned, metaphorically and literally in her reputation, while Jane rose on the smoke of her destruction. The court knew what was happening, but no one spoke openly about the timing. To question it would be to question the king's judgment, and that was dangerous. So they smiled, they bowed, they congratulated Jane on her good fortune. And in Chelsea, behind closed doors with her brother standing guard, Jane continued to play the role she had perfected, the innocent bride, untouched by scandal, simply accepting what God and the king had decided for her. 10 days after Anne's body was sealed in an arrow chest and buried without ceremony, the court received official word. King Henry would marry Jane Seymour. The announcement was handled carefully, framed not as a scandal, but as a restoration. Henry was presented as a man freed from a false marriage, now entering into a proper union with a virtuous woman who would bring stability and, God willing, sons. The public reaction was mixed. In London, where Anne had never been popular, there was little mourning. She had been seen as the foreign temptress who had displaced the beloved Catherine of Aragon, and her fall was viewed by many as divine judgment. Jane, by contrast, was English, connected to respectable gentry, and marketed as humble and pious. The propaganda machine worked overtime to paint her as the anti-Anne. But among those who understood court politics, the speed of everything left a bitter taste. Whispers circulated in private chambers, carefully out of Henry's hearing. Some courtiers found the timing grotesque, even if they dared not say so aloud. Others felt a creeping unease, wondering how secure any position truly was if a queen could be destroyed so efficiently. Jane's supporters worked to control the narrative. She had done nothing wrong, they insisted. She had not pursued the king. She had resisted becoming his mistress. She had maintained her virtue and her honor. If Henry had chosen her, it was because God had guided him toward a better match. Any suggestion that she bore responsibility for Anne's death was dismissed as slander. Jane herself remained largely invisible during this period. She did not make grand public appearances or issue statements. She stayed in Chelsea, waiting, as arrangements finalized around her. This absence was strategic. The less she was seen, the less she could be blamed. She became a symbol rather than a person. The pure bride, the fresh start, the hope for England's future. Her brothers, however, were everywhere. Edward Seymour moved through court with growing confidence, accepting congratulations, making alliances, consolidating power. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother, began positioning himself for advancement as well. The Seymour family understood that Jane's reign as queen might be the only opportunity they would ever have to secure their fortune, and they intended to extract every advantage. Foreign diplomats reported cautiously to their governments. Chapais, representing Spain, expressed tentative approval. He had despised Anne for her role in Catherine of Aragon's downfall, and saw Jane as potentially sympathetic to Catholic interests. The French were more wary, having lost an ally in Anne. They watched Jane carefully, trying to determine where her loyalties lay and whether she could be influenced. Beneath all the political calculation, one truth remained unspoken, but understood by everyone. Jane owed her crown to Anne's death. Without the execution, there would have been no opening. Without the fabricated charges and the ruthless efficiency of Cromwell's legal machinery, Henry would still be married. Jane had not ordered Anne's death, but she had accepted the crown it made possible. And in that acceptance, she became complicit in everything that had happened. The wedding date was set, May 30th, 11 days after the execution. The transition was nearly complete. The ceremony took place in the Queen's closet at Whitehall Palace, a small, private chamber used for intimate royal occasions. There would be no grand cathedral, no cheering crowds, no procession through London streets. This wedding was designed to be quiet, dignified, unremarkable, a contrast to everything Anne had represented. Jane arrived dressed simply, her gown elegant but understated. She wore white and gold, colors associated with purity and royalty. Her hair was loose beneath a jeweled headdress, styled in the English fashion, rather than the French hoods Anne had favored. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to signal a break from the past. Bishop Stephen Gardiner performed the ceremony. He was a conservative who had never approved of Anne, and his presence reinforced the narrative that this marriage was a return to proper values. The vows were traditional, brief, conducted in Latin. Jane spoke her lines clearly, without hesitation. Henry watched her with something that looked like satisfaction, though calling it love would be generous. Witnesses included members of Jane's family, select privy councillors, and a handful of trusted courtiers. Notably absent were many who had been close to Anne. Some had fled court. Others had been quietly excluded. The guest list itself was a political document, signaling who had survived the purge and who had not. When the ceremony concluded, Jane was officially Queen of England. No coronation had been scheduled yet. Henry claimed he wanted to wait until she was pregnant, to combine the coronation with the celebration of an heir. In reality, postponing the coronation allowed him to avoid the public scrutiny that a grand ceremony would invite. Too many people still remembered Anne's coronation, just 3 years earlier, remembered the expense, the pageantry, the hope that had surrounded it. Jane did not protest the delay. She accepted the title without the crown, the authority without the ceremony. Perhaps she understood that her position was more secure in privacy than in spectacle. Or perhaps she simply did what she always did, obeyed. The wedding feast was modest by royal standards. There was music, fine food, polite conversation, but no excessive celebration. The mood was subdued, careful. Everyone present understood they were participating in something historically grotesque, even if no one would say it aloud. A woman had been executed 11 days ago. Her replacement was now queen. The speed of it hung in the air like smoke. After the feast, Henry and Jane retired to the royal apartments. The bedding ceremony, a traditional ritual where witnesses would observe the couple put to bed, was skipped. Henry had grown tired of such customs, and Jane was spared the public humiliation. They were left alone, finally, after months of chaperoned meetings and careful performances. Jane Seymour had achieved what few women in England could even imagine. She had become queen, but the crown she wore was still warm from the woman who had died for it. And in the silent moments of that first night, alone with a king who had murdered his way to this marriage, she must have understood the fragility of her position. She had won, but the cost of losing, as Anne had proven, was absolute. History often portrays Jane Seymour as a passive victim of circumstance, swept up in events beyond her control. A modest woman who simply caught the king's eye and had no choice but to comply. That version is too generous. Jane was not innocent. She was complicit. She knew what was happening. From the moment Henry's attention shifted toward her at Wolf Hall, she understood the implications. She had served two queens before, Catherine of Aragon, discarded and humiliated, and Anne Boleyn, about to suffer worse. Jane had watched both marriages collapse from the inside. She knew how Henry operated. She knew what happened to women who displeased him. And still, she played the game. When Henry sent her gifts, she did not refuse them out of genuine shock or moral objection. She refused them strategically, following advice from her brothers and from courtiers who had turned against Anne. The returned purse of gold, the unopened letter, the declaration that her honor was worth more than treasure. These were calculated moves designed to increase her value. She was not protecting her virtue. She was negotiating her price. Jane understood that becoming Henry's mistress would lead nowhere. Mary Boleyn had been his mistress and ended up married off to a minor courtier with little to show for it. Anne had refused to be a mistress and became queen. The lesson was clear. So Jane held out, not because she was virtuous, but because she was smart. She also actively participated in the courtship. She sat on Henry's lap while he recovered from his jousting injury, an intimate gesture that blurred the line between innocent flirtation and seduction. She accepted his visits in Chelsea, knowing full well that Anne was imprisoned in the Tower at the same time. She allowed herself to be positioned as the alternative, the solution, the better choice. Jane was not forced into any of this. She could have withdrawn from court. She could have asked her family to remove her from the situation. Women of her status had done so before, when royal attention became dangerous. But Jane stayed. She leaned in. She let herself be used as the weapon that would destroy Anne, because she believed she would survive where Anne had not. Her brothers played their part, certainly. Edward Seymour was ambitious and ruthless, positioning his sister like a chess piece. But Jane was not a child. She was 27 years old, experienced in court politics, capable of understanding consequences. She knew that for her to rise, Anne had to fall. She knew that fall might be fatal, and she accepted it. There is no record of Jane ever expressing regret, doubt, or hesitation. No letter where she questioned whether this was right. No moment where she tried to intervene or slow the machinery of Anne's destruction. She simply moved forward, step by step, accepting each elevation, each gift, each privilege, until she stood at the altar 11 days after Anne's execution. That silence, that complicity, that willingness to benefit from another woman's murder, that was Jane's choice. And it defines her legacy as much as anything else she ever did. Henry did not kill Anne Boleyn in a fit of passion or sudden rage. He killed her because it was the most efficient solution to a problem he had created. And the cold logic behind that decision reveals something far darker than any crime Anne was accused of. By 1536, Henry's situation was complicated. He had broken from Rome to marry Anne. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had torn the country apart, executed those who opposed him, confiscated monastery lands, and reshaped the entire religious landscape of England. All of it justified by his need to marry Anne and produce a male heir. But Anne had not given him a son. She had given him Elizabeth, a daughter. Then miscarriages. Then another miscarriage in January of 1536, the one that might have been a boy. Each failure deepened Henry's frustration and reminded him that the entire justification for breaking with Rome had failed to deliver its promised result. Divorce was impossible. He had already used that option with Catherine of Aragon, and the process had taken 6 years, destroyed his reputation across Europe, and required the creation of a new church. He could not go through that again. More importantly, divorce would mean admitting the second marriage had failed, which would raise questions about whether God had ever approved of it in the first place. Annulment would not work either. His marriage to Anne had been consummated. There was a child. There were witnesses, records, ceremonies. Unlike his marriage to Catherine, which he had argued was invalid because she had been his brother's wife first, there was no clear legal ground to dissolve the union with Anne. Any annulment would be transparently false, and Henry cared enough about appearances to avoid obvious fraud. That left one option: removing Anne permanently. Not through exile or imprisonment, which would leave her alive and potentially dangerous, but through execution. If Anne died as a convicted traitor, Henry became a widower, a victim, a man who had been deceived and betrayed. He could remarry immediately without controversy, without waiting periods, without legal complications. So the charges were invented: adultery with 5 men, conspiracy to kill the king, incest, crime so heinous that no one could defend her without seeming to defend treason itself. The accusations did not need to be believable. They only needed to be horrible enough to justify the sentence that had already been decided. Thomas Cromwell built the case, interrogated the witnesses, extracted confessions through pressure and torture. But Cromwell was following Henry's will, not acting independently. Henry wanted Anne gone. Cromwell simply provided the legal framework to make it happen. The entire trial was theater. The verdict was predetermined. The execution was scheduled before the trial even began. And the dispensation allowing Henry to marry Jane was signed the same day Anne died, proving that her removal had always been about replacement, not justice. Henry convinced himself he was the victim in this story, that Anne had tricked him, seduced him, trapped him in a false marriage, that her execution was God's justice finally being served. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He wanted a new wife, and killing the old one was the fastest way to get her. When you pull back and look at the dates, the thing that hits hardest isn't just what Henry did. It's how fast he did it. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May, 1536. One day she was queen, watching a court tournament. The next, she was being rowed to the Tower of London as a prisoner. In that short journey along the Thames, her entire world inverted. The woman who had once entered the Tower in triumph for her coronation now entered it to await judgment and death. Within days, the net closed around the men accused with her. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn were all swept up, interrogated, and charged. There was no long investigation, no careful gathering of evidence. It was as if the script had already been written, and all that remained was to assign the roles. Confessions were extracted, statements were shaped, timelines were bent until they fit the story Henry needed. From arrest to execution, only 17 days passed. On the 15th of May, Anne and the accused men were tried. All were found guilty. 2 days later, the men were taken to Tower Hill and executed. Their deaths served as a prelude, a grim warning, an opening act. Anne remained in her chambers, knowing exactly what those executions meant for her own chances. At the same time, the legal paperwork moved with chilling efficiency. Archbishop Cranmer's declaration that Anne's marriage had been invalid was pushed through in the narrow window between the men's executions and Anne's own. In less than 3 weeks, Henry had managed to erase a queen, bastardize his daughter, and clear his own path to remarriage awe while insisting that law and religion were on his side. Then came the 19th of May, Anne's execution by sword on Tower Green. 11 days after that, on the 30th of May, Henry married Jane Seymour. 17 days from arrest to beheading. 11 days from beheading to wedding. Less than a month to dismantle one marriage and cement another. Measured against the 6-year struggle to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the speed is almost shocking. What once required debates, trials, appeals to Rome, and a complete religious revolution now took a handful of signatures and carefully staged deaths. That speed wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. The longer Anne lived under accusation, the more time there was for sympathy to grow, for doubt to spread, for allies to reconsider their silence. The longer Henry waited to marry Jane, the more obvious his impatience would look, the more people might connect the dots between his desire for a new wife and the charges against the old one. Speed solved both problems. It smothered questions before they could breathe. For Jane, this compressed timeline meant her entire rise from lady-in-waiting to queen was inseparable from Anne's destruction. There was no gap, no pause, no period of genuine mourning where history might have softened the edges. The dates exposed the truth Henry's propaganda tried to hide. One woman, as end and another woman's beginning, were not separate stories. They were the same event, told from two different sides of the scaffold. Jane Seymour became queen on the 30th of May, 1536. She would remain queen for only 18 months. In that brief time, she gave Henry exactly what he wanted, a son. Edward was born in October of 1537, and for a moment it seemed like Jane had fulfilled the promise that Anne could not. The kingdom rejoiced. Henry finally had his male heir. The gamble had paid off, but childbirth in the Tudor era was brutal, and Jane paid the ultimate price. She developed puerperal fever, an infection common in that time, and her condition deteriorated rapidly. Within days of giving birth, she was dying. Henry, who had coldly orchestrated Anne's execution, now kept vigil at Jane's bedside. He seemed genuinely distressed, reportedly praying for her recovery. She died on the 24th of October, just 12 days after delivering Edward. Henry ordered an elaborate funeral for her, something he had denied Anne. Jane was buried with full honors at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Her death was mourned publicly. The court wore black. Masses were said for her soul. She was given everything in death that Anne had been stripped of. Henry would marry 3 more times after Jane, but he never forgot her. When he died nearly 10 years later, he left instructions that he wanted to be buried beside her. And so he was. Jane Seymour, the quiet, obedient queen who had replaced a murdered woman, lies for eternity next to the king who killed to have her. There is something deeply unsettling about that final resting place. In Windsor, beneath the stone floor, Henry and Jane are together. Not Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, who he spent years trying to discard. Not Anne Boleyn, who he destroyed when she ceased to be useful. Not any of the others. Jane. Perhaps Henry chose her because she gave him the son that validated everything. Or perhaps because she died before she could disappoint him, before she could age or argue or fail to meet his impossible expectations. In death, Jane remained perfect, frozen in the role she had played so carefully. The obedient wife, the willing vessel, the queen who knew her place. But that tomb also tells another truth. Jane's rise to the throne cost Anne Boleyn her life. It cost George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton, Francis Weston, and William Brereton their lives. It cost England the spectacle of a queen tried and executed on false charges. And it confirmed that in Henry's court, power was not about justice or love or even desire. It was about control, ruthlessly applied. Jane Seymour was no innocent bystander. She participated willingly in a system that destroyed women who became inconvenient. And when her time came, when childbirth took her instead of the executioner's sword, she left behind a legacy inseparable from the violence that put the crown on her head. The secret nights Henry spent with Jane before Anne's execution were not romance. They were conspiracy. and the wedding that followed 11 days after a beheading was not a new beginning. It was the final act of a murder that had been planned for months.